what did we say adduction is? Adduction is bringing the limbs towards the midline, whether thighs or arms, right? So the muscles that are actually called adductors are the ones of the inner thigh. We have adductors here as well, but that's not what we're talking about. The 5 adductor muscles are the ones in between the hamstrings and the quadriceps. I'll name them for you, but we'll just really talk about a few of them at length. We have the adductor longus, the adductor brevis, meaning long and short. We have the adductor magnus, meaning very large. And we have the gracilis. And we also have the pectineus. I always seem to forget about the pectineus, tiny little muscle. So the adductor magnus and the gracilis, those are the two that I want to talk about mostly of these 5 adductor muscles. All of them are responsible for doing the same thing. Their main function is to bring the legs closer together towards the midline, which would mean, if we think about it logically, anytime we're taking our legs wide apart, the wider the legs come, the more we're stretching the adductor muscles of the inner thigh, right? If we take our legs super wide in a straddle split, that's the deepest stretch for the adductor muscles. But even when we do what's known as prasarita padottanasana, most people are familiar with this stretch in yoga, the wide open leg stretch where we're coming down this way over the legs. Most people think they're just stretching their quadriceps, but in essence we're stretching both quadriceps and adductors. It depends on the individual. Some people are tighter in one group, some people tighter in the other, so you'll get more stretch in one or the other, but you're stretching both. The difference between the magnus, the adductor magnus, and the gracilis versus the others is a small difference which I want to go over. The gracilis muscle, gracilis actually means slender, is the very thin muscle that goes from the pubic bone down the inner thigh and all the way to this point. I'm going to get a new skeleton. Watch out. All right, it goes all the way from the pubic bone to this point, the inner shin bone, the inner knee. It's actually the only one of the 5 adductors that crosses our knee joint. Once again, all the other adductor muscles, they start someplace on your hips, someplace on this hip skeleton, and then they'll go to the femur bone. But the gracilis is the only one that goes from the hip skeleton down past the knee joint. So it does this job, it brings the thigh towards the midline, but it also does another job. Since it crosses the knee joint, we can say that it is a synergist with the hamstrings. It's an assistant, the synergist to the hamstring muscles. The hamstring muscles do this, and the gracilis muscle can help them do this. To feel the gracilis pretty easily, all you have to do is take your legs wide apart in a seated position. Once your legs are wide apart, go ahead if you like, try to take your fingers up the inner thigh, and you'll feel a little ropey quality of the inner thigh. The closer you get to your pubic bone, the more you'll feel this tightly wound, ropey muscle, which almost feels more like a ligament. The closer to the pubic bone, the more it feels like connective tissue and not a muscle. Depending on your body, you might be able to trace that muscle all the way down to the tendon that inserts below the knee joint, and that's the gracilis. If you do a lot of yoga and you've ever attempted to do a full straddle split, the gracilis is the main muscle that's going to prevent you from doing that. The other muscle I wanted to mention was the adductor magnus. That's because it's such a large muscle, and it starts, like the hamstrings, it starts along the sitting bone. So oftentimes when we're stretching with our legs open and we feel a tightness when our legs are wide, we assume that it's the hamstrings that are limiting our stretch. And people say, oh, I have such tight hamstrings when the legs are wide, but oftentimes, more often than not, it's the adductor magnus. It starts at mostly at the same point of the hamstrings. but instead of going past the knee joint, it just comes to the femur bone. So, I'm going to rename this Laurel and Hardy. So, the adductor magnus does not flex your knee joint like the hamstrings does. It adducts the legs, but it does feel like a hamstring muscle often, and it's very large and very strong. So we can easily mistake it. Now, there are a few good ways to eccentrically lengthen the adductors. Most people, to be honest, most people, their challenge is going to be to stretch the adductors, because let's say you don't do a lot of stretching. Let's say you're new to yoga or Pilates. You probably have spent a lot more time stretching your hamstrings than stretching your adductors. People throughout their life don't want to stretch their adductor muscles because it's too challenging. Taking the legs wide apart is not something we do on a regular basis in our activities. But hamstring flexibility is something we do. We stretch our hamstrings before a run, if we feel tight after a long drive. So adductor flexibility is probably a very important issue. But adductor eccentric lengthening, we can do that in Warrior II position. Laura, a good example here. Let's start with Warrior I, actually. And you can take your left leg forward, keeping this a little straighter. So we saw Warrior I earlier. In this position, her hip flexors here are stretching all along here. This is eccentrically lengthening. And her adductors aren't being used to any great degree. A little bit for stability, right? They're stabilizing. Not a great stretch on her adductors. Now, as she turns her hips and then opens her arms, that's Warrior II position, Virabhadrasana B. Let's do that again. The mistake people make, do it without rotating your hips much. This is the mistake most people make. They turn their shoulders, but their hips stay this way. So from Warrior I to Warrior II, you want to move the hips first, then the arms. Need a little rest? Okay. So now, since her thighs are widening, rotating, and coming forward, her inner thigh muscles are a little more open, a little more stretched. But at the same time, they still need to stabilize her. So she's eccentrically lengthening her adductor group. Okay, thank you.